Good. Welcome to everybody. I see a number of people joining us for this book launch. I'm just going to let you all get your audio set up, and as many of you as you can. It's lovely to see your faces as well. If you're able to turn your camera on, no pressure to do so if you would rather not. But it's brilliant to see so many people with us here this afternoon. I'm just going to give another few seconds just for more people to join us, but I think we're getting in good shape here. So a very, very warm welcome to you on behalf of the Center for Catholic Studies here at Durham University. My name's John Barclay, and I've been asked to chair this book launch session. I'm the Lightfoot Professor of Divinity at Durham University. I've been here for nearly 20 years now, and for most of that time I've been a colleague of our good friend and wonderful colleague Matt Guest, who I will introduce in just a minute, and whose book, of course, we are discussing this afternoon. Now, the format of this session is that after introducing Matt, I'm just going to ask him a few questions about the book that he's written, so that we all get a good picture of its contents and its main theses. But while I do that, and indeed at any point during the session, please feel free to introduce yourselves to everybody by using the chat function. This is a very informal kind of book launch in which we like people to be able to meet each other, as it were, in this virtual way. So let me invite you, if you would like to, just to put into chat who you are and where you're from, so that we can get a sense of who everybody is. Now, as I say, I'm going to ask a set of questions to Matt about his book, just so that we all get familiar with it. And then we have two very distinguished guests in this session, Professor Linda Woodhead and Professor Tricia Bruce, who I will introduce when it comes to their turn, who have agreed to be respondents and to give each a 10-minute response to the book we're discussing today. And there'll be a chance for Matt to respond to those responses. But there's also a chance for you to ask questions of Matt, to pose him any questions you'd like for this session. So there will be an open time for you to ask questions. And the best thing to do is for you to put those into chat, and I will pull out some of those questions in the last section of this book launch event, and so that you'll have a chance to get your questions addressed at the end of the session. The session, we're running to a fairly tight timetable, and the session will finish at the latest at 6:45, a quarter to 7. So we have about an hour and a quarter together, and we will, I think, just get going straight away. Now, Professor Mathew Guest is the professor of the Sociology of Religion here in the Department of Theology and Religion at Durham University, where he is also, since 2021, the head of our department. He's authored a number of books before this point, co-authored a book on evangelical identity and contemporary culture. Sorry, that was a single-authored book, Matt, wasn't it? But he's also co-authored a couple of books on Islam on campus, and another one on Christianity and the university experience. But the book we're discussing today, which is on Teresa Phillips' screen, but I'm holding it up here too, is called Neoliberal Religion, Faith and Power in the 21st Century. A wonderful book that traverses really critical features in the phenomenon of religion in the present day. It was published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2022, so it's a recent book. And Center for Catholic Studies is really pleased to host this book launch and to get this book widely known. So, Matt, if I can just ask you a few questions just so that we become familiar with your book. Could you say a little bit about why you wrote this book and who you've written it for?
Well, thanks, John. It's really great to have the opportunity to talk about this in this context. So why I wrote the book? I mean, in practical terms, I wrote it because lockdown conditions meant we had to stay at home, and I had plenty of time that I wouldn't otherwise have had. But the more serious answer is I've been working on something for a while that had to do with the relationship between Protestant Christianity and capitalism, and it developed out of that. And then as the project developed further, it was driven increasingly by a sense that the sociology of religion which is the discipline in which I work, was really out of kilter with broader social conditions. So there've been plenty of studies that had recognized that we live in a social context radically framed by market values, pro-market values, consumerism, and so forth, but very little attempt to change the conceptual apparatus of the subdiscipline in light of that transition. So to say just to recognize we're in a different context, I was trying to argue that actually we need to go further than that and develop new approaches to what we're looking at, because it is such a different phenomenon from what we're used to. So that was the conceptual rationale. Who I wrote it for, principally for my colleagues in the Sociology of Religion and students in it, to give them a provocation. It's by no means the final word. I mean, and there's lots of speculation in the book, but I wanted to put something out there that triggered a bit of debate about the conceptual apparatus of the subdiscipline and how it relates to our cultural conditions. But secondly, I also wanted a broader public to be able to engage with it. So I hope it's intended to be accessible. I hope it's accessible to a broader readership, so that those who are interested in religion, in all its complexity, in all its social complexity, will have an opportunity to engage with a book that is up to date and takes seriously the way in which religion is embedded in its social context.
Great. It certainly does communicate very well. I have to say, my specialism is in New Testament and early Christianity, but I love reading sociology and anthropology of religion. I have to say, I found your book very accessible and absolutely fascinating. Can I say something about your title? Because your title is Neoliberal Religion. And could you just explain a bit what is meant by neoliberal, and also what you mean by neoliberal religion? I think many people might have thought you might have a title like Religion in the Neoliberal Age, but I think your thesis is stronger than that. There's not just in an age, but actually something about the way religion has developed in certain contexts, at least. So could you just say a little bit about your title, Neoliberal Religion? Yeah.
Sure. So I'm taking neoliberal to indicate the approach to economics that elevates the market and advocates for a small state. The form of economic neoliberalism that we associate with, in political terms, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan from the 1980s onwards, but which has achieved a huge amount of influence and dominance, really, even beyond the market crash of 2007 and 8. So a very pro-market, anti-regulation approach to economics. But what I'm principally interested in is how those assumptions, the assumptions associated with neoliberal economics, translate into cultural conditions. So I break that down into three key facets, elements of neoliberal culture that frame the way in which we live our lives in all sorts of respects. So the first is a heightened individualism. So if classical liberalism was really about the freedom of the individual, neoliberalism orients itself towards the ability of the individual to freely consume. And so that's one aspect. The second aspect is the taken for granted assumption that competition is the best indicator of value. So the assumption that in order to get at the best version of anything. We set things in competition with one another and see which one prevails, see which one wins. And we see that in all sorts of social spheres. And the third is a tendency to treat social values, objects, phenomena as commodities. So things to be exchanged, to be bought and sold. And insofar as these notions frame the way in which we experience culture, and insofar as I take it for granted that religion is a cultural phenomenon, it's to be expected that religion will be framed by these things as well. So I'm interested in the relationship between religious phenomena and those cultural changes that have taken place. As to why it's not religion the neoliberal age, two reasons. One is there's already a book called Religion in the Neoliberal Age, and trying to learn something from what I'm studying. It helps to have a distinctive brand. So that wasn't really an option. But having said that, as the project developed, it became clear that I wasn't just interested in the way in which religion exists within a neoliberal set of conditions. What I was interested in was particular forms of religious expression that are generated out of neoliberal conditions. There's not a lot in the book about resistance to neoliberalism of a religious kind. There's not a lot in the book about how different religious traditions across the board react to neoliberalism. What I'm interested in is those examples where religion takes on board neoliberal assumptions and integrates them into its way of behaving in the world.
Right. Thank you. That's very helpful. I found this book fascinating because you developed so many different facets of that thesis, of the way neoliberal conditions have actually shaped religion, and indeed many different religions, because that's part of the point. You're not just focusing on Christianity here. Could you sum up what you think are the most important contributions you've made in this book? What do you think are the key elements of analysis you've brought about under that general heading of neoliberal religion?
Yeah, sure. So the main aim is to probe what I'm calling the cultural space within which economics and religious forces come together to achieve meaning and social expression. So that's the broad intention of the book. What I argue is that this manifests in a series of different sort of cultural conversations, if you like, not conversations necessarily in a conscious sense of dialogue, but in the sense of an exchange of resources and assumptions that comes from religious organizations or movements adapting to the cultural conditions in which they live. And I argue that these conversations proceed primarily through 5 principal sites or sort of moments of influence, thematically organized. So I talk, and these are divided across 5 chapters within the book. One is religion and marketization, so the tendency to treat things as markets. One is religion and populism, because I think there's a particular way in which populist politics relates to neoliberal conditions. One is about post-truth and what the post-truth era does to the destabilization of knowledge and what that does in terms of a market of truth claims. There's a chapter on securitization, which is about the regulation of religion by the state, because I think neoliberal conditions don't just free up religion. And there's a lot of work that assumes that religion is necessarily more free to innovate under neoliberal conditions. What I'm suggesting is actually there's a counter movement to that, whereby the state seeks out particular kinds of religion and labels them as illegitimate or a risk, and in so doing makes them a target for regulation. And finally, there's a theme that relates to developments of ideas of the self that have to do with entrepreneurialism. So there's a chapter on religion and the entrepreneurial self. So I'm arguing that these themes perform a kind of a function of serving a site through which this conversation between neoliberal culture and religious organizations or movements takes place, and with a variety of different, sometimes quite unpredictable consequences. There's another facet to the argument, which is that I'm trying to advocate for a different kind of approach to the sociology of religion. sociology of religion has adopted a variety of different dominant approaches over the last few decades. Secularization remains hugely influential as a theoretical paradigm. The alternative to that is that we go down the route of rational choice theory and treat religion as itself a form of economic exchange. So religious people adopt religious identities insofar as they maximize benefits and minimize costs. And there's been some counter reaction to that amongst those who favor a cultural sociology of religion, which is much more about localized meanings, qualitative nuance, ethnography, the importance of meaning making at the micro level. What I'm trying to advocate for is a cultural sociology of religion that takes neoliberal values seriously. So that says neoliberal economics is really important to how we understand contemporary religion, but it's filtered through cultural sites. It needs to be taken seriously as a site of cultural influence, not just as economic. So I'm interested in how neoliberal values translate into a cultural register, and in so doing influence religious expression.
Thank you very much. Those 5 chapters, I found each of them really, firstly, I think my favorite was the one on post-truth. I have to say, I found that really, really fascinating, the way you analyzed the phenomenon of post-truth and how that manifests itself in and out of religious developments in the recent world. One of the just really attractive features of your book to me is the way you combine the study of big concepts, sort of high-level conceptual discussion. You combine that with very concrete and specific examples, which are taken both from Christianity and from elsewhere, especially perhaps Islam. Those two seem to feature particularly in your book. So I wonder if you could just outline for us 2 of the examples that you have chosen, just so we can get a sort of flavor of how you see these macro forces and these larger concepts being evidenced in particular cases.
Sure. So I mean, so there's a couple of examples that come to mind, and as you say, they do derive from Protestant Christianity on the one hand and Islam on the other, and that's not surprising given that they're both conversionist faiths. And so one might expect that it's conversionist religions that would make entering into a conversation with cultural conditions more of a priority, because it's more of a priority for them to reach out and communicate with the unconverted in order to bring them to faith. So it's not surprising we would expect certain forms of Islam and certain forms of Christianity to be taking on board neoliberal ideas or trends. So the 2 examples, the first is Hillsong Church in Australia, which some of people may have heard of, which hugely influential mega church that both has a variety of campuses across the world, but also has become a kind of a template for church vitality amongst many imitators across the nation, across the world, who try to reach young people. But as they do, and part of this is something we've seen many times before, which is a mega church context that is exuberant and loud and exciting. But what it also does is it represents something that I'm calling in the book a turn to the cosmetic, which is a kind of valorization, a tendency to emphasize the importance of physical markers of identity that have to do with youth, affluence, beauty, and fitness. And in so doing, elevate a particular kind of person as associated with Christian identity, which raises all sorts of questions about, well, what counts as a good Christian and what do they look like? And what about those who don't fit that model? And Hillsong has done some really fascinating work in taking that model of the cosmetic and developing it in dialogue with commercial industries. So if you go to the Hillsong conferences, which are gender specific, so they spend a lot of time developing their work to try and frame what they understand a godly man would look like and what a godly woman would look like. And surprise, surprise, the godly man is courageous and characterized by valor and strength, and the godly woman is submissive and concerned with beauty and nurture. And what's more interesting, I mean, that's not surprising in itself, but what is interesting is the way in which they derive the images of femininity and masculinity from the cosmetic industry, from the fashion world, in order to elevate a particular model of what the good Christian looks like. So that's one Christian example of the dialogue between neoliberal sort of market commercial worlds and religion. But that convergence between religion and fashion isn't distinctive, isn't exclusive to Christianity. There's a fascinating development in the Muslim world of veiling fashion. So this is the process whereby modest religious dress is combined with developments in the broader fashion industry to produce religious clothing for women. It's a huge, highly successful, both in a commercial and a cultural sense, phenomenon within places like Turkey, which have a majority Muslim population. It's fascinating because it shows how commercial developments and apparently conservative religion can enter into fruitful conversation with one another. And it also, in turn, tells us a lot about the capacity of what we might assume to be traditionalist conservative religious movements to adapt to the cultural conditions in which they find themselves.
Thank you so much, Matt. That's given us a wonderful taste of the contents of the book, and I'm sure will entice many to pick it up, as I certainly encourage them to do. Now I'm going to turn over to our respondents, and as I say, we're very fortunate to have two academic experts in this field who've kindly said they would offer a 10-minute response to this book. And first of all, let me invite Professor Linda Woodhead. Linda Woodhead is the F.D. Morris Professor at King's College in London, where she's also the head of Department of Theology and Religious Studies. Very, very well-known expert in the sociology of religion and both in the public and the academic domain. Delighted to have you with us, Professor Woodhead. If you'd like to give us your response to Matt's book, we'd be very grateful.
Thank you very much. Delighted to do so. I wanted in my 10 minutes to have a bit of a push and a probe and a poke at the concept of neoliberalism, so that we can all learn from Matt in as I do that and how he responds. Because I wonder if it hasn't become a bit of a bogeyman in the book. I mean, I wonder if it's really as big and bad and dominating as the impression that the book leaves the reader with. So I thought I'd do a little test, Matt, of this. So I'm going to ask everyone listening to this if they could put their hand up, if they would identify, having heard Mathew describe, even if you haven't read the book, you've heard Matt describe what a neoliberal is. Does anyone in the Zoom room identify as a neoliberal, or at least be sympathetic to neoliberal views? One hand. Well done. Well done. A brave hand. That in a way is my worry, you know, that we can all read the book and tut-tut and think this is a terrible thing. But if the movement is really as big and all-encompassing and influential as Matt is saying the thing called neoliberalism is, then how come we don't like it? We don't identify it. Are we just all slaves and we're just oppressed? Or are we dupes? We just don't realize that we've actually absorbed neoliberal values. Because it is a rather horrible thing, the way it's described. Matt gave us a little definition then in terms of three things. And he mentioned individualism and tied that with consumerism. So I'm an individual insofar as I consume stuff. He mentioned competition. And in the book, there are some really unpleasant examples of competition as bullying. You know, really, competition is about winners. It's very, Trump kept popping into my mind. It's about who's got the power and who's got the most power and who's going to win in this competition. And thirdly, he said it was about commodification. Everything's up for sale. Everything's got a price tag. Now that combination of things is pretty evil in most people's minds, I would think. Well, I know from surveys that very few people will identify with that. So if it's so bad, Matt, why is it so widespread and influential? And are we all victims of it? That's my first question. So then I thought, well, let's try and put a more positive spin on neoliberal values so they actually sound like values and they actually sound like things we can affirm. And I went back and looked at some surveys I've done in the UK, and Alan Wolf's surveys, particularly good ones, and interviews in the US. And the thing that people do identify with very widely is freedom. Yes, we are liberals in the UK and the US. We put a high value. If you pose the question between should I be free to live my life as I want it, rather than should I obey authorities, we're very high on the liberal scale in both countries. So freedom, certainly. But the other value that doesn't get mentioned in the book, really, that some people do identify with, is self-reliance. The idea that, we've all got, really, each one of us has got to stand on their own 2 feet, and there's a limit to how much welfare the state can give. There's a limit to how much of a helping hand, and people today are a bit too, ready to blame someone else and not take responsibility. I think that is a positive value that many people who are more to the right wing politically would identify with. And it is a positive value, but it doesn't get much mention. The other thing that I do see in the surveys that people say, young people particularly, is they've got more trust these days, young people in the US and the UK, I've done this survey, they've got more trust in businesses than they have in the public sector. Quite surprising, but that they are more positive about, and think businesses are generally more trustworthy than the public sector. If you're dealing with a business, you're probably, in most cases, going to get a better service. They're more responsive than our public sector institutions, including, no doubt, universities. So that is quite a widespread value. And I suppose we're all consumerists to some extent, but whether it actually is our ideology, that's another question. So I think there are values, but I'm not sure they get much airtime in the book. And then the other thing I wanted to say about, because neoliberalism is a concept. I mean, not many people actually say I'm a neoliberal and here's my ideology. Perhaps the closest we've had recently in the UK is Liz Truss. Liz Truss, I don't know if she does use the word neoliberal, but she was very much in her mini budget, a kind of textbook free marketeer speaking to people who read that kind of ideology and getting a positive response from a small number of Conservative Party members. But that's not a widespread view, and her success and her term in office shows us that that is not popular. That is quite rare. So how widespread is this neoliberalism really? And what does it really amount to? And what I want to propose, Matt, for your consideration, is that neoliberalism competes with other stances and values and ideologies, because you're interested in culture and so is mine. But I think we have many sediments, many layers, and they're competing. And this is just one. And it's not as popular, certainly in the UK, as I think the book gives the impression it is. And you gave a very good example at the beginning of your book, actually. In the preface, you talk about writing it under COVID. But isn't COVID an example? I mean, doesn't it show, what was so surprising about COVID to me was that everyone obeyed the state without question in the most extraordinary way. It told us the most extraordinary things. Stay at home, shut down your business, do not go and be with a loved one when they're dying. And people obeyed those things. The state was so, I mean, it just marshaled so much authority. It was quite extraordinary. Isn't that a counter? Doesn't that show that there's actually more going on in society than neoliberalism? And then finally, a lovely thing about this book is that you do end by talking about the ethical responsibilities of the academic and of the sociologist of religion in particular. So there is a positive message to take away, at least for the sociologists of religion, about what we should be up to and what might be useful about our academic work. And you say your conclusion really is that what we're about, what we should be doing, isn't being value neutral. I've sounded rather Marxist, it's illuminating the conditions of oppression. You say, if we function as social scientists, we are bound to attend to the social contexts of moral concern. This means recognizing individuals never act in a vacuum. The decisions they make are framed by opportunities shaped, at least in large part, by the social circumstances in which they find themselves. And you say that our job is to lay bare, I quote again, to lay bare configurations of empowerment and disempowerment. I think that's your bottom line ethically. That's what we should be doing, laying bare such configurations of empowerment and disempowerment. Well, maybe for some people, but isn't the ethical task of academic work broader than that? And have you perhaps swallowed the neoliberal pill because you're seeing everything in terms of contestation and competition and power? So the only way, and I agree with John, I love the chapter on fake news and post-truth, but your analysis there is that this has come about partly because of neoliberalism and because it just sees, one truth is as good as another one. It's just which one wins, which one's more powerful in the competition of ideas, which has got more oomph behind it. And aren't you saying the same, really? But isn't part of the academic enterprise to just tell the truth, to try, it's jolly hard work to get facts, to launch your surveys, to do in-depth empirical work, and to get really quite reliable findings. And then even harder is to get them listened to. A lot of people, including members of religious communities and leaders, do not want to hear them. And it's very, very hard to get them taken seriously. And there's a lot of pushback, and there's a lot of, oh, your method isn't right, and all that didn't go to a representative group, and all sorts of ways of trying to undermine you, and more underhand ways too. And that's a moral task as well, trying to tell the truth, trying to present your findings, even if you don't like what you found, which is often the case, and other people don't like what you found. So I wondered why, in a post-truth world, you didn't think our ethical job was to try and not just tell the truth, but do so in a way that can garner enough authority to be listened to, because it is true we are now in an age where our authority as professor this, that, or the other is not going to work. We have to be trustworthy as well. Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much, Matt, and everybody else for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you for posing those very, very helpful questions. I'm sure Matt's going to be thinking about those before he responds, but I'm going to turn over now to our second respondent. Delighted to have with us from Tennessee, I think, Professor Tricia Bruce, who is a longtime friend of the Center for Catholic Studies and has visited us here in Durham. She is an affiliate of the University of Notre Dame Center for the Study of Religion and Society. Is published widely in the Sociology of Religion, especially in relation to the Catholic Church in the United States. So Tricia, Professor Bruce, a very, very warm welcome to you, and please go ahead now with your response to Matt's book. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I will say also, while I was in Durham, I had the pleasure of actually sneaking into Matt's office a few times while he was away, probably thinking through the ideas that percolated into this book. So thank you also for letting me steal away some time in your office space and that beautiful territory you all have there in Durham. What a wonderful book this is. And I would say what a wonderful opportunity it is for us also to pause and think and rethink and question our very assumptions that we're making and the kinds of questions and terms and presumptions that guide our work as sociologists and as observers or participants of religion broadly construed. The book enters that moment of a COVID reality, which itself was this occasion to think deeply in ways that were arguably quite uncomfortable for us. And so I would celebrate this book as one of the wonderful products and highlights that we can celebrate out of such a difficult time. This book is also, in addition to being timely, it's deeply personal. And I would say too that, Matt, I hear you in this, and you are not shy about bringing in your own examples, your own experiences, not only from your research, but also from your life and your scholarship and your work and your interactions with others. And that humanizes this book in a way that makes it more accessible to all of us. So I very much appreciate the ways that you made it so personal. This is really a provocation. I like the word that you used when you described it. And I found myself wondering, well, who is this book really for? Because I think you can actually answer that question in different ways. Certainly, you can think about it as a tool for students of religion or the sociology of religion who are trying to grapple with the world around us. You can also think of it as a toolkit, a revised toolkit for those of us whose professions are devoted to this study of this thing called religion. But it is both a textbook and really a challenging device that helps us say, we need to think about ourselves as both producers and consumers of this work that we are doing. And so I pick up from really where Professor Woodhead ended up at the end there, which is these questions about what does this mean for us as sociologists of religion, how we're doing the work that we're doing. And really, it invites us to think of ourselves as students, to think of this as a textbook for us, to really begin to rethink how we're entering the work that we're doing. This book does a fabulous job of naming the social forces that are seen and observable in behavior and action, that are sometimes labeled under the valence of something that becomes a convenient theory, which is imperfect in describing what we're actually seeing. The book is very clear about saying we need to ask, what is the dominant logic? It tries to find a pattern in the kind of diversity and chaos that we observe around us, and through that identifies this thread of neoliberalism as a dominant paradigm, the imminence of economics over other forms of thinking, this kind of dominant market logic that impacts everything from our degrees to notions of beauty to religion as itself a commodity. And this idea of the privileging of individual choice above shared concerns, which makes it difficult to mobilize resistance. The book itself aims to sort of, as he says, probe the cultural space within which economics and religious forces comes together. And I think that this is, well, not unfamiliar. He certainly grounds this in long-standing social theories going back to Max Weber. So these questions have certainly been asked before, but we're in this moment where we need to ask them again, and we need to ask them differently. As Matt summarized before, really, he hones in on these 5 cultural forces that really matter as sites of neoliberal influence. So marketization that draws religious movements into the logic of commercial markets, popularism, reshaping opportunities for political engagement, the destabilization of knowledge. I really liked how that was phrased, that allows us to explore religious innovation, patterns of securitization. There were a few words I have to say I stumbled over a handful of times, which I love. There's nothing like an academic book to put an isation on every word that we have. So well done on that. And then a heightened individualism that converges with marketization to produce these kind of entrepreneurial orientations. But I love the way that these forces then kind of push against the blinders that we might hold, secularization being a prominent one among them that obscure our vision otherwise. So my remarks and my takeaways on this especially relate to a handful of the chapters therein. I, like others, was really sort of drawn to this chapter on religion in a post-truth era. And of course, as sociologists of religion, we hear and talk a lot about truth, right? Big truth, little truth. And we are living in an era in which all sorts of questions are circulating around truth. One of the things that I appreciate overall about this book is that it names things that are there. So they're familiar. And I really think the best sociology names what is familiar to us, but for which we don't yet have language, either by way of a conceptual name or a working definition. And Matt's book does a really excellent job of doing that. And here too, with this idea of post-truth, he names this in a way that I find very accessible and translatable to lots of different spaces, talking about how post-truth is a heightened tendency to reject or dismiss truths based on established authority. But he points out it's not just about the truths themselves being debunked, but it's the fact that they still hold weight and power after they are debunked. And this is a different kind of reality that we're pushed into that begins to raise all sorts of questions about legitimacy, notions of heightened relativism, and our relationships to authority. I mentioned that I'm thinking, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking constantly back to this question of what does this mean for us as sociologists of religion? And in this chapter, he dives into this notion of the disillusionment with experts. Not only that, but how the forces that tend to privilege authorities with whom we already agree, or facts that affirm what we already think. Now, of course, as sociologists, we are not immune to these impulses. And I had to think, this is something that we really need to be more cognizant of. And I very much appreciate Professor Woodhead's poignant questions in this regard, too. What kinds of assumptions are we bringing here? And are we actually dealing with the kinds of questions that are and the kinds of facts that are either enabling us to sort of support the theories that we're most intrigued by, or in fact, that are actually unveiling something about society that we need to think more carefully about. And also what establishes our truth. I know this is a question that you revisit later in the book in a really helpful way, but I couldn't help but ask myself, well, how as sociologists of religion who are ourselves engaging in this kind of conversation about truth, what is truth, whose truth, are we actually theorizing ourselves out of the conversation? How do we as sociologists engage with this notion of truth, big T, small t, while also recognizing this force, and that's the word that you use, I like that word, this force that is actually shaping the very questions and assumptions that we make and the ways that our work is being received. So that chapter, I think, is a really useful one and can be picked up in lots of different ways for conversations about politics and well beyond. Likewise, the chapter that focused on the entrepreneurial self, the assumptions of the entrepreneurial approach that comes with neoliberalism. I have to say that any book that mentions reality TV as a marker of cultural movement and difference and shift is really, I love it. It's really pointing out something that I think is both important to be aware of, but also just, very much situated within the context of what our world is today. This chapter especially pulls in on a number of examples from Hillsong and otherwise to sort of exemplify the entrepreneurial self, preoccupied with religious identity as an unfinished identity, which I really appreciated that notion of the entrepreneurial self as sort of pushing on religious identity itself as being unfinished, but all kinds of identities. He brings up these different things about how these forces are ones then that make us look towards the flexibility of identity in ways perhaps that we haven't fully been cognizant of before. I do, of course, wonder Again, how does this overlap and think through our approaches as sociologists of religion? I couldn't help but think too that this chapter was especially illustrated by the examples from Protestantism that you brought in. You brought in some other examples as well, but I do wonder if there's a pushback on that, looking through the lens of traditions that do have a heightened focus on tradition and collective access to truth, that might put a different spin on what the entrepreneurial self looks like within the context of these neoliberal forces. And I think as sociologists of religion ourselves, who might have this sort of impulse to entrepreneurialism, then we need to also think about these understandings of relativism and how we're being cognizant of the how religion and other forces are volleying for legitimation with different sources, as you point out. I loved the power and religious difference chapter too. I will just say that that was a really nice setup to really forefront the need for us as sociologists to be cognizant of the role of power and inequality and the intersectionality of these different things. And that'll lead me into the what I will say, especially about the ethics and the sociology of religion, which I want you to have the most time here to be able to engage our conversation and questions. But let me just say that the chapter 9 on retrieving ethics for the sociology of religion, I found to be especially fruitful because it does something that most books don't do, which is actually turn that lens very cognizantly on ourselves and on the ways that we're doing this work and how we are engaged very directly in doing the work of trying to understand the social dynamics of religion. And turning those tools on ourselves is a really challenging thing. Matt brings up in this chapter the role of neutrality, the sort of troubling legacy of methodological atheism. And I really like actually how you hedge yourself, which again, there's a humility throughout this book that I think is very useful, that doesn't lean on absolutes, but makes room for ambiguity. And this is one of those places where it comes up because he says, maybe it's methodological agnosticism. Maybe we sort of enter with the questions rather than answers. He talks about the value of eliciting definitions of religion that aren't established from the outset, but emergent from the research that we do as sociologists of religion, which I think is a useful reminder, but sometimes one that we conveniently set aside in the task of setting up our theories for the broader discipline as it's set up. So I'm left, of course, with these both instructions and questions for my own work as a sociologist. I thought that you provided some really useful tools, particularly the one, and I won't repeat it, but it's the one that Professor Woodhead pointed to that engaged these questions about, how do sociologists see themselves vis-a-vis activism, and you didn't use that word, but I found myself with a really useful answer to that question about, how do we make decisions about where we're sort of pushing for or addressing inequality and where we're not, and as we heard, your approach is very much one that is centered in exposing empirical observations that allows us to see injustice while not necessarily taking those next steps and alleviating it. Perhaps that is not our role as sociologists. And I thought that that was a really useful and smart approach. I wondered too, in a broader sense, this is an assumption that you didn't necessarily question, but I saw kind of hinted in various places, both here and certainly in other work of yours. Is sociology of religion even the right term? Should we call ourselves sociologists of religion? There are certainly conversations that have percolated and are happening even now about, what should we name our associations? What should we call ourselves? Are we making room for things or leaving things out? Are we actually pre-baking our findings by coming in with this certain, even this label that we have already? And this book, again, I think led me to a place of thinking maybe it's time we also revisit those assumptions and what they mean. I also was left wanting the good news. It's a little bit of a downer of a book. there's some good news, but I wonder too if you can point out, what are some of your hopeful takeaways and moments and opportunities for us to hold on to something that feels right and promising and encouraging, particularly as we look at a discipline that is really effectively trying to replicate itself into the future so that this work continues to matter and do good work. So I would love some positive takeaways to be able to think about as we move forward, in addition to the rightful recognition of some pessimistic observations that you've made. Thank you very much for this wonderful work.
Thank you so much, Professor Bruce. Thank you. That was a wonderful contribution. So I'm going to ask Matt now to respond to those two great responses that we've had. But can I also ask, I want to make the floor open as well after Matt has spoken, to anybody who wants to ask a question in chat. So if you want to ask a question, and I think it's best to form it as questions rather than just statements, but if you would like to ask Matt or indeed either of the respondents a question, please feel free to do so. This is a very open forum, and so if you'd like to put that into chat, I will pick some of those questions to pose to Matt. So feel free to be part of this conversation and put a question in chat anytime in the next few minutes. But Matt, first of all, over to you to respond to our respondents. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda and Trisha, for taking the trouble to engage so concertedly and thoughtfully with the book. I didn't realize I was so doom and gloom. I thought I didn't think it was that negative, but maybe it's a reflection of my kind of ethical thoughts on the broader context. But just for clarification, I don't think all aspects of neoliberalism are terrible. I think there's much to be said for entrepreneurial approaches to all sorts of things. And I take the point where self-reliance doesn't feature. I don't really consider that side of it. And that's perhaps a gap that reflects my own preconceptions and perspective. But to go to Linda's points first, is it all as bad as I make out? Well, I don't think I'm portraying it as that disastrous or cataclysmic. I think there are some serious issues that relate to the way in which neoliberal assumptions enter into culture and shape religion, and they have questions arising from them that are morally urgent. And maybe I'm just more interested in that than in positive consequences, of which, of course, there are some. I suppose I'm also, and this kind of goes back to the chapter at the end about ethics, is that I'd like to think there's a bias towards the powerless in the analysis, insofar as, if there are lots of powerful white old men who do very well out of neoliberal religion, then I don't think that's something to celebrate necessarily as something that indicates broader patterns of inequality we might be best to be more aware of. So that's another way of looking at it. But not many people self-identify as neoliberal. Well, that's of course true, but I think that's a bit like saying not many people identify as modern. I think there's a way in which the term captures something that's so deeply ingrained in the way in which we live that it's almost like common sense. It's as if you talk to a policymakers about why do you use competition to discern what's the best version of a school or a university or a health service or whatever. It's such a taken for granted assumption. There's not really a conversation being had about alternatives. And that's what I mean about taken for granted assumptions. So I do think it's pervasive. And it's become such a dominant normal that I don't think people are always aware of that, or perhaps cognizant of alternatives that might be possible, perhaps because there aren't alternatives when you're in a position of precarity or a position where your choices are deemed to be limited. So I do think it's important. I think it's highly influential, but I think imagining alternatives can be difficult. And the fact that it's not quite so visible is perhaps, as a term, is perhaps indicative of its success. You go back to the other points. I'm really interested in what you said about people trusting businesses more than public sector. I mean, that's fascinating, and I'll have to look into that. The Liz Truss reference. I mean, it is really one of the things that really fascinates me about that case, even though she was disastrous and tanked the economy and really represents a kind of hyper free market conservative politics that doesn't command the support for across that party, even quite aside from other parties, is that she does reflect an orientation to economics that's very influential in particular think tanks, which in turn are very influential over government policymaking. And I think there is a sense in which there's a small coterie of people who are having a disproportionate influence on the direction in which the economy and society are going. And that's reflected in that phenomenon. Everyone obeyed the state during lockdown. Did they, Linda? I don't think they did. I think I heard of plenty of examples of not just outward defiance, but strong resistance to towing the line, which I think in itself was a reaction. And in the States, of course, it was even more profound. And I think the resistance illustrates how profoundly influential neoliberal assumptions are, because the reaction was, who are you to tell me how I should live? Who are you as the state to tell me what I should do and how I should behave and who I should mix with? And even to go into the post-truth stuff, who are you to tell me what's bad for my health? And I think there was a lot more resistance to that than there would be suggested in your comment. I think there's probably more compliance in certain parts of the UK or in certain demographics than others, but I think there was also quite a bit of resistance. Am I seeing everything in terms of contestation and power? Probably. Yeah, I think I probably am, and maybe I'm becoming more Marxist as I get a bit older. I'm not sure why. I think part of it is, Linda, because
I wasn't going to say that, Matt, but actually I think that's true.
I think that is true, yeah. And I think, although the bar is pretty low, I mean, you don't have to say much in an academic book to sound Marxist. I mean, you just have to kind of talk about power in a way that's critical. But I think that's true. I think that is true. And I think this is, and it's interesting that Trisha said there's more of me in this as a person than anything I've done before. And I wanted it to have an ethical dimension to the voice. And when I speak about things I find draw from my ethical convictions, they almost always have to do with power or the lack of it. And yeah, I'm good with that. I'm quite happy with that. Trisha, really appreciate your response and your reflections on this. I think I'm just looking through my notes here. Yeah, there's an interesting counter argument there about the entrepreneurial self that looks towards, as you put it, collective traditions that advocate collective access to truth. And I'd be fascinating to learn more about that, because I find it difficult to see that in the context that I've looked at. Or at least perhaps there are different levels of engagement with truth which take on different permutations depending on their influence or the context people are working in. There seemed to be a greater propensity, I know Linda might know more about this than I do, certainly in terms of younger generations, of people to hold concurrently different versions of truth and not find that to be problematic. And that's where the post-truth thing, you can turn post-truth on its head and say, on the one hand, it's destabilizing knowledge. On the other, it's empowering people to voice perspectives that otherwise would have been marginalized. So there are different ways of presenting that. Where is the good news? Well, I talked to John about this when after he read the book, about possibilities of resistance to some of the more insidious ethical moral developments that are implied in the book. I think I have to do that in a different one, because I couldn't see positive examples within the framework I was using that would retrieve that kind of positive voice, that good news. There's definitely stuff there to be talked about, but perhaps I need a different way of thinking it through in order to identify them and do them justice. What I didn't want to do within this book is to present the critical analysis as it is, and then sneak in a couple of exceptions at the end and say, well, it's not all bad, because that would seem a bit flimsy. So I thought, well, best do the whole thing and see it through, and then I'll come back to the more positive news in a different book when I'm clearly feeling more optimistic about the world. But I do appreciate your comments, and it's good to shine a light on things in this way, because I never thought it was negative, but clearly it is. But thank you so much for your comments, and it's so lovely to see you, Trisha. I haven't seen you for ages, and Linda, as always. We've talked about this on a number of occasions now, and it's always great to hear your perspective. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Matt, and thank you for your answers to those questions. I'm going to give everybody, of our main speakers, a chance for a final word at the end, if they would like, in a few minutes. And I'm just picking up a few things in chat, though I'm very happy for other people to ask questions in chat if you would like to, about this book or about what's being said about it. So feel free, please, to add anything you'd like to. So we had a question from Andrew Davis. It's really kind of methodological question about how sociology of religion as a discipline relates to theology as a discipline, and the kind of claims that are made in let's say Christian theology about what's going on in religion, and just it's about how these two kinds of discourse relate to one another. So Andrew asks, must a social scientist assume that the Holy Spirit plays no part in causing religious believers' thoughts, beliefs, and actions? You make such an assumption, I think. He says you presumably wouldn't be given credit for your academic work otherwise, yet theologians and religious believers more generally might well criticize you for that reason. How might you respond? I know you've thought about this, kind of these kinds of discourse and how they relate to one another. Do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the theology and religious studies are, I think, quite unique insofar as they take seriously discourses that are wholeheartedly discredited within the context of other disciplines because of the secularization of academia. There will be people in other kinds of social science who dismiss religion outright as being ineffectual and nonsense. So we shouldn't even give it credit by taking it seriously. And obviously, I don't advocate for that, and I'm sure no one on this call does. But it does raise an interesting question about how we deal with theological language within a social scientific register. Peter Berger, the famous Peter Berger's response to this was to say that it's not the place of the sociologist to talk about theological claims insofar as they're truth claims. So it's not the place of the sociologist to remark on the credibility of those claims, merely to reflect on their projection within social reality, so their consequences in terms of action. I think that's probably fair, and it certainly marks a fairly neat demarcation between disciplines. I don't think it's sustainable in any profound sense, because the lines are always a lot more blurred than that. I mean, I might say, if someone said, do you think the Holy Spirit plays a part in explaining social reality, then I wouldn't say no at all, but I wouldn't know how to articulate the statement. And perhaps that's partly my reflection of my convictions as a person, but also the fact that I don't really do theology. So I'm more comfortable with a division of labor that says, on these issues, I'm just not commenting. And on these issues to do with social reality, I'm speaking with authority or evidence or what have you. And then try and bring into conversation experts within both fields in order to have a fruitful conversation, which I think is what we should be doing. But I'd rather do that than try and conflate the two. I find that very difficult. There are others may be able to do that, but I can't.
That's really helpful. It's very, very helpful clarifying response, Matt. Thank you very much. So have a question from Ricky Whitefield. So thanks, Matt. Great book, great responses. In a world where much emphasis is placed on engagement and stated positions, active or even forceful stance taking on myriad contemporary issues, where and how might a sociologist of religion appreciate indifference? That's to say, not activism or active engagement, but the sheer indifference and its social production and the consequences. Is neoliberalism really an affirmative value stance, or is it simply about thoughtlessly consuming stuff at ever increasing speeds?
I suppose there's an element of that. There's a. I saw a great interview once with Marilyn Manson, the singer, who said that we're driven by fear and consumption. We're fearful that we don't meet up to people's expectations, so we consume more, and that kind of captures that dynamic of how neoliberalism functions. That we're driven to meet the expectations of a consumer culture by buying more stuff or buying the right stuff. There is that kind of manic consumerism that's associated with the context we're in. Whether this is unthinking and I don't think it's indifferent, because it clearly matters to people that they are making the choices that they think are the right ones. And I don't think they are entirely cynical consumer choices either. I think consumerism is hugely influential. That doesn't mean every choice someone makes is superficial and comparable to the process of buying a laptop or an ice cream. There are parallels there, but there are also quite important differences. So, I don't want to assume that because we are living in a consumer society that all the actions that can be called consumerist are necessarily superficial and unthinking. I think there's more subtle analysis that can be done there.
Great, thank you. And here's a question. It's on something that you touched on here about resistance to neoliberalism, from Michael Corderbank. Are there aspects within contemporary religion which are consciously contesting this assimilation to neoliberal cultural assumptions? And what do you see as their chances of successfully mounting resistance to the dominant paradigm? To what extent are alliances between religious resistance to neoliberalism and secular civil society organizations?
There certainly are examples. There are plenty of examples of religious groups that are offering a counter narrative and trying to push back against neoliberal assumptions and values. I think the question of the chances of their success is an interesting one. It depends what you count as success. I mean, if you're saying, is it, because it's one thing to say, can we transform society so that it's no longer neoliberal? Well, without a violent revolution, probably not. Can we ensure that counter narratives are heard and occupy a place of influence? Well, that's a more modest aspiration, but probably the right one. And I think we can. It's increasingly difficult, especially within a context of economic precarity, because people don't have time to be protesting. They have to spend more time putting food on the table. And in a way, that's the most sort of devastating impact of a hypermarket economy, is when it exacerbates the gap between the haves and the have-nots, when levels of inequality become dramatic, that not only do you reinforce marginalization, but you remove people's capacity to resist it. So there's, yeah, I mean, I think there are all sorts of questions there. But I mean, we talked about this, John, a while ago, and there's much more to be done about the forms that religious movements take when they're trying to resist these powers, and how they do that, and with what consequences. I think there's also an interesting question about whether, sorry, that's my dog, whether there are hybrid forms of religion that draw on particular aspects of the neoliberal, but combine them with other influences, and in a kind of progressive way. I don't think it's a dualistic situation here. We're not talking about polar opposites.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Matt. I'm just going to allow one more question, and this is from Ruben Gonzalez Vicente, who says, thank you for a very interesting discussion. My question is, if neoliberalism and neoliberal politics have changed religion, how has neoliberal religion transformed political engagement? In other words, has the influence gone the other way, or at least from religion into politics? I can imagine you'll probably say yes and cite Trump, but I don't know how you want to respond to that. Yeah.
I think there are plenty, and this is why the chapter on populism was important to me to include, is because one of the questions that it speaks to is, to what extent has there been a politicization of religion, but also a religionization of politics, if you like, that's been enabled by this renewed relationship between religious concerns and political aspirations. And we see it in Turkey under Erdogan, we see it in the US under Trump, we see it under Bolsonaro when he was leading Brazil, a whole lot of other examples where populist politicians draw on religion as a source of credibility and power in order to get where they want to be. And I don't think that is just about a strategic approach to religion. I think it's a different way of doing politics altogether that has to do with populism and resisting what are construed as the elite, whether they are universities or businesses or the state, in order to present as being more in tune with, in inverted commas, the people. And I think that's taken on some very powerful forms in recent years.
Thank you very much. Now, our time is almost up, and I want to just give Linda and Trisha a chance to say anything if they want to add a comment here. And one of the signs, it seems to me, of a good book is it produces so much fruitful thought, and also suggests things to be done next, as it were, or things to be done further. So Linda and Trisha, if you want to reflect on that, like what have you learned from this book that we could take further?
That's a great question, John. So sorry, Trisha, I just jumped in because that was the order we went in, but is that okay? I was so provoked by that question. I think, and listen to this discussion, which has been very interesting indeed. Thank you, Matt. It's always interesting. That I wouldn't call myself an optimist, but I think I'm somewhat less pessimistic than you, because I think there's more variety out there. You know, I think there's more cultural variety and contestation and alternatives, and actually, it's, of course, you see that on the ends of a political spectrum and in the most obvious forms of political contestation and activist, so on. But actually, most of us in both the US and the UK, which have been our main focus, are somewhere in the middle. Most people are. I mean, that's empirical. And I think it's also, there's a lot of evidence to say that for most of us, this division between the values on the one hand of solidarity, social cohesion, service to others, and on the other hand, individual freedom, self-reliance and choice, that division goes right through our own hearts. We like both those sets of incompatible things. And we're all torn. And sometimes the political situation pushes us one way, sometimes the other way. So, John, my answer to you is, in terms of the study of religion, I would imagine that some forms of religion would do very well if they could somehow hold that tension in our hearts together. I think they've all tended, the big institutions have tended to go to the let's all love each other side of things. I wonder if there's a form of religion that could hold the tension, somehow ease it in our own hearts.
Thank you so much. And Trisha, final thought from you? I have to be brief, I'm afraid, as we're running out of time. Yeah.
Celebrate again and to say thank you for this great work and the questions that it raises. A moment ago, you referenced manic consumerism, but buying things for good reasons. So I'll just make a pitch that this is a very worthy book. If you're going to be a manic consumerist, I recommend this as a way to continue to prompt this conversation. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. And Teresa has posted in chat some codes which provide 20% off for buyers when ordering directly from Bloomsbury. So both for UK and for customers elsewhere. So if you, as I hope you might be interested, as I was fascinated to read this book, then that is the place to go. Matt, final word for you, from you rather.
I would just say thank you so much to Trisha, Linda, and to yourself, John, and to the CCS for hosting this wonderful event. I was always, just to refer back to the COVID situation, when we had lockdown, I was hearing all of these online meetings that the CCS were putting on through Karen and Paul, and I was always really jealous of the numbers, because I thought, how on earth are they getting so many people? It's clearly that they've built up this great community of online engagers, and so it's wonderful to take full advantage of that and to be able to speak to this forum. So thank you to everyone who's taken part today, and I've really enjoyed it and appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And so let me just finish by saying thank you to you, Matt, for this book and for your willingness to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much to Linda and Trisha for your very, very helpful comments and questions, provocations. Thank you so much for being part of this. Thank you to the CCS for organizing this. The Centre for Catholic Studies has done a fantastic job with a number of book launches. This has been a very successful one today. So thank you, Karen. I don't know whether Paul's on this call as well, but thank you to you for setting this up. If you want to sign up to the CCS mailing list, you'll see in chat a website that Teresa has just posted there. So thank you, one and all. I think we'll call it a day here, and I'll say farewell from Durham. Yeah, bye for now. Thank you so much, Matt, Linda, Trisha. Thank you, thank you for joining us. Well, Matt, that was a good conversation. I think we all enjoyed that.
Me too. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Good. All right.
Good book to argue with. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Linda.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.